Hello and welcome on board. You're watching Eye on Africa and I'm Clarisse Fortuné. Our top stories. Kenya's President Ruto orders a review of MPs' pay rise following a public outcry. People were questioning how the salaries of politicians could be raised during a financial crisis. Human Rights Watch says Ethiopian army attacks healthcare in the country's Amhara region. The NGO accuses Ethiopian security forces of war crimes. And we'll hear from Tunisian families whose loved ones lost their lives during the Hajj pilgrimage. Kenyan state officials were expecting to get higher salaries, but now President William Ruto says he's ordered a review in that pay rise. His decision comes a week after mass protests forced him to drop a controversial finance bill that included tax hikes. People began questioning how the salaries of politicians could be raised when there was a supposed financial crisis. Olivia Bizot reports from Nairobi.
Following a huge amount of criticism on social media, Kenya's President William Ruto has asked the National Treasury to review the Gazette notice dated from last August regarding the salaries of the state officers in the national and executive government, the Senate and the National Assembly. He said that now more than ever it's important for state officers to live within their means. Those proposed salary increases would have come into effect at the beginning of this month. Meanwhile, the Azimio opposition coalition has rejected those salary increases and has said that that money should instead be reallocated to workers in the public sector. MPs in Kenya are the second highest paid lawmakers in the world relative to GDP, and they would have been exempt from the proposed 2024 financial bill tax increases. That bill is what sparked mass protest across the country, forcing President William Ruto to withdraw it. But despite Ruto not having signed that bill into law, people are still incredibly angry. They've been taking to the streets across Kenya, and they want President William Ruto to resign.
Ghana is set to become the manufacturing hub for vaccines in West Africa following the injection of 32 million euros into the country's pharmaceutical sector. The country was one of the most affected by shortages in vaccines at the peak of the COVID pandemic. It has since been working towards building its own structures to produce its own vaccines. Justice Baidu has more.
At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ghana began steps to be able to produce its own vaccines. The financial support that is being announced today as part of the Ghana-EU Business Forum is part of a bigger plan to help boost trade and business between Ghana and the European Union. Last year, the country set up its National Vaccine Institute to build policies and research around vaccine production. Today's announcement is being hailed as a big step towards making the country a big producer of vaccines.
It's going to create jobs. It's going to also help us to also have vaccine and other medicines sufficiency, and then improve the health outcomes of the people of this country. And as the president said, we are going to prepare ourselves for the next emergency and epidemic. Never again shall we be found ourselves wanting when there's something like COVID.
The country has already received support for its Food and Drugs Authority to be able to effectively regulate vaccine production when it starts in earnest. Other private sector players have also received the funding to be able to set up the infrastructure required to support vaccine production.
It's a financial tool of some 1.5 billion euros altogether, available to all countries, at least in the continent, and supported together with the European Union, the European Investment Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop similar health projects in the health sector to strengthen the strategic autonomy of our partners in sub-Saharan Africa.
Today's announcement is part of a two-day summit currently happening to help connect Ghanaian businesses to markets in Europe.
3 people have died after being arrested during riots in southern Mauritania. Unrest broke out following the results of the presidential election, which saw President Mohamed Ould Sheikh Al Ghazouani re-elected. Opposition figure Biram Dar Abeid says he refuses to accept the results, calling the National Electoral Commission an electoral masquerade. The results still need to be ratified by the Constitutional Council. Clémence Valère.
Mauritania's electoral woes continue as the opposition refuses to concede victory. Following Monday's preliminary results, which saw the incumbent president re-elected with over 56% of the votes, riots broke out in the south of the country. In a statement, the Interior Ministry said security forces arrested a number of rioters in Kaidi after looting and vandalism broke out on Monday night. 3 people were reported dead following their arrests, 2 in custody and a third later in hospital. Presidential candidate and opposition figure Biram Da Abeid condemned the violence and the results.
The violence with which the authorities have treated these peaceful demonstrations shows that they are an unelected power, a dictatorial power imposed by fraud and brute force against the will of the people. We reaffirm before the authorities that we refuse and continue to refuse the results of this electoral masquerade.
The Interior Ministry said the situation was under control after authorities cut access to the internet and arrested dozens of protesters in the capital, Nouakchott. Meanwhile, Mauritania's Electoral Commission has dismissed claims of election fraud, with international observers noting that voting took place in a peaceful manner.
The counting operations were carried out transparently and in accordance with procedures in the presence of observers and candidates' representatives.
Biram Da Abeid called on his followers to stay mobilized and continue to peacefully protest. He also asked his newly elected opponent to engage in sincere dialogue with the people.
Human Rights Watch's new report on the conflict in the Amhara region of Ethiopia accuses the military forces of war crimes. The NGO condemns the repeated attacks on health facilities. The conflict between the federal forces and the local militia, the Fano, broke out over a year ago following the government's decision to integrate the regional forces into the national army. Clotilde Hazard has more.
The report underlines numerous attacks on health facilities taking place in at least 13 towns in the Amhara region, where the conflict keeps on raging for over a year now. The report documents the testimonies of 58 victims and witnesses of abuse interviewed remotely by the organization. These testimonies describe violences, intimidation, and arbitrary arrests of health professionals providing care to the wounded and sick. It describes alleged illegal attacks on ambulances and medical transport. According to the NGO, this is hampering access to humanitarian aid and seriously disrupting hospital operations. Human Rights Watch also notes that patients are intimidated and deterred from seeking the care they need. The organization records 9 humanitarian workers killed since the fighting began. This report urges Ethiopia's international partners to demand accountability, resume independent monitoring of rights, and increase their support for the rehabilitation of damaged health infrastructure. Since the start of the conflict, the Ethiopian government has not commented on the various reports by NGOs and the UN accusing the armed forces of human rights violations in the country's second largest region.
Quite a damning report there. 2 weeks after the end of the annual Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, questions are still being raised about the heavy death toll. Many blame the 1,300 deaths to extremely high temperatures, some pilgrims' old age, as well as the influx of pilgrims without authorization. 60 Tunisians died, and a tragedy led to the Minister of Religious Affairs to be sacked. Lilia Blaise and Hamdi Tlili went to meet the families of some of the pilgrims.
In Ben Girdan in Tunisia's south, Fatiha's family had been mourning a death, her husband who died from a heart attack while he was doing pilgrimage to Mecca. In Islam, a pilgrim who dies in Mecca is buried there. Fatiha returned with a heavy heart.
I went around the place. I went to the Libyan pilgrims, the Turkish ones. I went to all the hospitals, but I couldn't find him. I looked everywhere showing his photo, but nothing.
She was only informed of her husband's demise 6 days after his death. The reason for the delay? A problem in identification. Fatiha and her husband were not registered as pilgrims. The couple left May 14th on a tourism visa without authorization for the pilgrimage, but they stayed to do it, like Ammar, who went with his wife.
Sometimes with the quota system, you wait 10 years before being selected. And it's also very expensive, more than 25,000 dinars per person.
This year, Tunisia received 211,000 applications, but only 11,000 were accepted. So Ammar paid half the official price by going through an intermediary who organized his journey.
We go with someone who knows well Saudi Arabia. He puts us in a house we rent near the prayer space, and we do everything by foot.
Journeys by foot in temperatures of 50 degrees, without a guide, beside flows of thousands of people. Ammar's wife got lost without a phone. She was still missing when we finished this report. Unauthorized pilgrimages are now a matter of public concern.
It's the Ministry of Religious Affairs with an official delegation who organise all the logistics and who organise everything. Outside of this framework, pilgrimage travel is not permitted. It's forbidden for travel agencies to work on the Hajj travel.
According to Saudi authorities, out of 1,301 dead, 83% didn't have authorization to do the pilgrimage.
South Africa's new unity government were sworn in this Wednesday following weeks of coalition haggling. On Sunday, President Cyril Ramaphosa unveiled his coalition government with 32 ministers. It includes Angie Motsekega, Minister of Defense, and John Steenhuisen, leader of the former main opposition party, and today Minister of Agriculture.
I'm fortunate that I was in the previous government, so I know exactly where the challenges were, where the gaps are, and to work with the new team to say how do we support the department to be able to perform optimally.
I intend to turn the agriculture sector into a growth area, both growing output, improving crop yields, but also growing international markets for South African products and being able to ensure that South African farmers, particularly emerging farmers, are supported.
Now, I must confess I find the following video extremely cute. Have a look. This is Freya. She's a 6-month-old lion cub and she was rescued from the wildlife trade in Lebanon. And as you can see, she's now found a new home in a sanctuary in South Africa at the Drakenstein Lion Park. I hope she'll have a good life there, and South Africa has a good reputation for conservation, but also as a thriving captive lion business. Well, that's the end of this edition. Thank you for watching Eye on Africa. More news to come.